It is Sunday, September 25th. Welcome to ABC-7 Extra. Good evening. I'm Stephanie Guadian. We are now less than 24 hours away from what is being called the biggest presidential debate in history. More than 100 million people are expected to watch the first debate between Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton and Republican candidate Donald Trump. For the next half hour, we will take a look at the candidates' different debate styles, their strengths and their weaknesses. You will hear from borderland experts in politics, government relations, and psychology. And we want to hear from you tonight. You can always email us your comments and your questions now to ABC-7 Extra at KVIA.com. And you can also reach us at 915-496-1771. On Twitter, just remember to use the hashtag ABC-7 Extra. That 90-minute debate with no commercial interruptions is being held at Hofstra University in New York. The high-stakes contest between Clinton and Trump could set the momentum for the rest of the U.S. presidential campaign. ABC's Mary Bruce reports from Washington.
The stage is set and the expectation game in full swing on the campaign trail.
What we're concerned about is that there might be some sort of double standard here.
I really don't appreciate campaigns thinking it is the job of the media to go and be these virtual fact checkers.
Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump's campaigns trying to set the bar on what will likely be the most watched political showdown in American history. Their first presidential debate being compared to the Super Bowl, 100 million people expected to watch. And the race couldn't be tighter. A new ABC News Washington Post poll shows Clinton holding at 46%, Donald Trump just 2 points behind, but still within the margin of error. The Clinton camp hammering that Trump needs to be called out on lies.
In a 90-minute format, not 20-second sound bites, there's a real opportunity to hear somebody say something and then get into, is that actually true or not?
Meanwhile, Trump says he expects the moderators to be harder on him. The most powerful Republican in Congress, House Speaker Paul Ryan, hopes Trump is doing his homework.
Look, Hillary Clinton's been doing this most of her life. She is the consummate pro. This is new for Donald, so I think he should obviously over-prepare for it.
The psychological warfare has already started. First, Clinton's campaign invited Trump's nemesis, billionaire Mark Cuban. The Republican nominee responded by tweeting, "Perhaps I will put Jennifer Flowers right alongside of him." Flowers, the woman who had an affair with Bill Clinton decades ago, reportedly said, "Yes, I'll be there."
Why did he send out that tweet?
Because he wants to remind people that he's a great counterpuncher. She has not been invited by the campaign.
While both candidates are spending the day preparing behind closed doors, both had meetings with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. A brief pause before the epic face-off. Mary Bruce, ABC News, Washington.
And joining us now are Dr. Neil Rosendorf, Associate Professor of International Relations at New Mexico State University. And we also have Psychology Professor Dr. Ketlar, also from NMSU, Tim, and Dr. Richard Pineda, who's Associate Professor at the Department of Communication at UTEP. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. Well, certainly America, talking about what is going to be happening tomorrow. They've been talking about this matchup for quite some time. A lot of people describing this as maybe the most bizarre, unsettling political time that they can remember as far as elections go. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't necessarily know that it's the most unsettling. I think what we're really seeing and what we've seen over the course of the last 2 or 3 years is a heavily media-driven campaign. I mean, you've got Facebook, you've got social media. So people are talking more about this in really closed spaces, and I think that that's amplified the conversation. Plus, you've also had a primary that started so incredibly early with the Republican Party, a huge slate of candidates. And so in some ways, it seems like we've been in a perpetual campaign for close to a year before getting to Labor Day, where the traditional campaign period would start.
But you actually said to me, you know, for those of us who really follow politics, it does feel like that we have been following this for a very long time. But for some people in America, this is going to be the first time that they meet these two close up.
It's hard to believe at this stage of the campaign because, we are wonks, we are junkies, we are professionals, we follow this all the time. But for most Americans, they're just starting to engage. I know it seems almost unbelievable, but that's the way the stats have played out. And this is the opportunity and the peril for the candidates. Will they be able to introduce themselves properly? Will they be able to unconfirm the bad things that people have heard about them over the years? Will they be able to remake their reputations? Will Donald Trump be able to make himself, well, presidential, go over that line? Will Hillary Clinton be able to project a warm and winning personality? But this is the beginning for most Americans in this cycle.
Okay. And what do you think people are specifically going to be watching for? Because they are not going to just be listening to what the candidates have to say. With your psychology background, they're also going to be watching. What are they watching for?
Yeah, as my colleague Neil suggested, a lot of people are going to be tuning in for the first time. Everyone has a set of narratives about each of the candidates, and this is the candidate's opportunity to either solidify that narrative in the case of a positive narrative, or if it's a negative narrative, a narrative of untrustworthiness or not being presidential enough, it's their opportunity to repair that narrative. So there's a lot of nonverbal behavior, showing of confidence and trustworthiness that candidates can engage in during the debate to work on those narratives.
Okay, and these candidates are so different, even in the ways that they prepared for this debate. Hillary Clinton having someone play Donald Trump as she gets ready, and then Donald Trump saying that, you know, he really doesn't want to over-prepare. Well, what's the idea behind that?
So traditionally what happens in debate preparation is that you have a separate war room focused on the debate. There are policy briefings and big briefing books that are put together, and essentially it's a sequence of homework and then a series of actual presentations. Generally what happens is the candidates get to watch two proxies debate as themselves and somebody else to kind of watch and see how things unfold, and then they go through the verbal and nonverbal coaching. I think that Trump is probably doing something very similar, but I think with so much of what he does, it's really about the sort of brass of how he approaches it. But I would suspect if you looked at both of those war rooms, they would look very similar. The policy briefings would be very similar. The question is, how much of that information and data will he bring into the debates? Infamously, when Sarah Palin was prepped for her debates, she was given the briefing books and didn't read them and didn't prepare, and so as they went through the training, she seemed to be really inadequate in terms of information. I think that there's a good chance that Trump will prepare in some fashion to have that information. It's almost a certainty that Clinton is doing the exact same thing, given the nature of her experience in the field.
So to add something to that, those are excellent points. And of course, you know, there's an article in today's New York Times entitled "Debacle," and debacle, of course, is Al Gore and the way he conducted himself during the debates in 2000. And he felt really confident. Indeed, he felt perhaps supremely overconfident, and he came across with all of his briefing book preparation as arrogant in the extreme. And the nature of the article is that you've got folks who are participating reminiscing, and they said he killed himself, figuratively speaking, in that first debate, that he came across, as I said, as arrogant, that George Bush was over the line in terms of looking adequately presidential, and that was the beginning of the end for the Gore candidacy. And that's how important a debate can be.
And it's interesting that diagnosis of being arrogant came about through the nonverbal behavior of Gore, who many saw as having very high expectations as an expert debater, and George Bush much lower expectations.
So what about Hillary Clinton, though, as the first female candidate? What kind of challenges does she face in a debate like this?
In some sense, we don't know what to expect, because this is the first face-off between a female candidate and a male candidate at the presidential level. We've seen that at the vice presidential level before, and I think we do see, for better or worse, we see different standards being applied to men or women. You mentioned the New York Times, they just ran a piece on Sunday about the different standards that might be applied to a female candidate as opposed to a male candidate. So those who are tuning in for the first time, if they have certain expectations about what it means to be presidential, and those are based in part on gender, they're going to play a role in how people perceive this debate.
But there's one non-gendered component. So Debacle, the article from the New York Times today, is framed as a warning to Hillary Clinton. And it's not about gender, it's about wonky stiffness. A wonky stiffness that the article claims she shares with Al Gore in 2000.
I think the other issue, and you saw this morning on all the Sunday talk shows, is a question of expectations that are set by proxies. So in other words, all of the folks for both campaigns have a very unique narrative going into Monday. So for the Trump side, there was a lot of conversations of how well prepared Clinton would be, how much information she's already processed. On the Clinton side, I think there was expectations that Donald should be judged critically, because this isn't just a one-shot deal, but reflective of where he's been through the campaign. So I think you've got this intersection of the the candidates themselves, which we'll see play out tomorrow night, but you also see the strategy of how you prime and how you shift expectations going into the conversation. And I think in some ways that's the part that's interesting to watch, because this is a much more long-term strategy that's been thought out over the course of 3 debates plus 1 vice presidential debate. So a lot of what will happen tomorrow night, I think, will give us some insight to not only what's going to happen in the other debates, but also how quickly the campaigns are going to want to try to adjust to make sure that those remaining debates meet different kinds of expectations.
Okay, I want to play part of an interview for you. A lot of people speaking about tomorrow night's debate, the importance of it. Here is how former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani, who is a Trump supporter, I should mention, describes the event.
Probably one of the most important presidential debates in American history. I mean, so I guess the Nixon-Kennedy debate was the most famous because it was the first one, but I think this one will have an audience that'll be far greater. And I think we'll also have 2 candidates who have totally different views of America.
Yeah, candidates with very different views. 100 million people expected. How do we draw a crowd like that?
Well, it's a bigger crowd than the Beatles drew on their first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show in February of 1964, which was about 70 million. So that gives you some sense of how much attention is being paid to this. I mean, of course, we won't know until the numbers run there, but 100 million is a lot of people. John, Paul, George, and Ringo would really like it.
Right, but why is it? Why is so much attention being given to this one? Is it because the candidates are so different in their viewpoints? Is it because there's a man and for the first time a woman?
I think there's a couple of factors. I mean, I think gender is certainly a part of it, but I do think that Trump, both as a personality and as a media figure, is very good at acquiring a lot of media attention. I mean, I think one story after the election, regardless of who wins, is the real focus on how free media works versus paid media. And one thing that the Trump campaign has been very good about, and I think this is a structured strategy, less something that he stumbles into or his team stumbles into, by making headlines, by saying sort of over-the-top kinds of things, it guarantees that the news headlines for those days follow what he's done. And in a case like this is certainly meets the mantra that any kind of coverage is great coverage, especially going into what's likely to be a very close election.
It's certainly close right now. Just a couple points separating the two. What are you hoping to hear from the debate tomorrow?
Well, I'd love to hear some substance on foreign policy. I mean, they have very, very pronounced differences when it comes to foreign policy. I'd love to hear them both talk about those things. I'd love to hear them talk about, in a measured way, their views on immigration policy. Of course, that's of considerable importance in our neck of the woods here, but for the country at large. I think that as a foreign policy specialist, those are sort of the core issues that I'll be listening for first. Foreign policy, where do they come down?
Okay, we still have a whole lot to talk about. You can catch that presidential debate tomorrow night right here on ABC-7. The debate begins at 7 o'clock. And if you for some reason can't watch the debate, we will have a full recap for you on ABC-7 at 10. You're watching ABC-7 Extra. When we come back, if you would like to share your comments or you have questions for one of our guests, you can do that. You can call our comment line at 496-1771. And if you're online right now, you can email us, ABC7Extra at KVIA.com. You can also tweet me. Just remember to use the hashtag ABC7Extra. We'll be right back. Professor of International Relations at New Mexico State University. We also have psychology professor Dr. Tim Ketelar, also from NMSU, and Dr. Richard Pineda, who's an associate professor in the Department of Communication at UTEP. Thank you all for staying up late and joining us tonight. I want to talk a little bit about the different debate styles. The Donald Trump that we saw when he was up against his Republican potential candidates, he came off as very abrasive. He came up with some negative nicknames for them, if you will. How would you describe Hillary's debate style?
Well, I think that the preparation for her will focus largely on detail and policy. What I think will be interesting is to look for moments where the program soundbite comes in. And something that I talk with my students a great deal about is the idea that the debates themselves, while the substance may change depending on the moderator, there's so many things that they've already pre-thought and they've already worked up whatever recent scandal or whatever talking point the other candidate has used, and they work those into the zinger. And so you'll be looking for those kinds of things. I think for Clinton in particular, the strategy team has probably worked with her to control her reaction. The assumption being, of course, that going into this, Trump will poke at her. And I think in what we saw with the Republican presidential debates, I mean, with so many of them, that was a strength that Trump used in each one of those debates by activating and by sort of pushing and by using nicknames when it came to his opponents on stage. Their reactions were really what the conversation was about, less that Trump himself was actually not presidential or was doing something that was out of the norm.
And their reactions are not scripted, and that is something that the public, the viewers, suddenly get maybe just a glimpse into the unrehearsed candidate, would you say?
Yeah, and if you think about it as a psychologist, you always think about the interaction between the personality and the environment. And here the environment's going to drastically change. The primaries, we saw a debate where each candidate only had a short amount of time to get across their message. And in that environment, Donald Trump seems to be born for that type of soundbite environment. And now he's going to have 45 minutes. In a typical presidential debate, we expect they're going to have a more elaborate policy discussion. So I think a lot of people are turning in for that schadenfreude moment. They're looking for one of the candidates to stumble. Now each candidate cannot rely on another member of the panel to help them out or to gang up on another opponent. They have to answer the substantive question using a lot more time. That's going to be difficult. And so a lot of people are tuning in, I think, for that schadenfreude moment. They're looking for a candidate to stumble. And so with 45 minutes of speech, many are wondering if Donald Trump's going to be at a slight disadvantage here, or will he actually be able to carry the day?
Actually, if anything, I feel a bit sorry for Hillary Clinton, because if there's one word that would sum up Donald Trump as a debater in presidential politics, it's unprecedented. There's not been anybody like him ever. Going back to Lincoln Douglas in 1860. I mean, if you look at the candidates over now it's, my goodness, 56 years since Kennedy and Nixon, these have all been controlled guys who have been looking to put across a very, very classically presidential demeanor. And he has absolutely no interest in that, or at least very little interest in that relative to anybody who's come along before. He's gotten away with things that nobody could ever have dreamed before. And to try to face that on stage when your entire career has been based on a much more traditional, much more conventional approach to politics, no matter how much they prep her, this is going to be tough sledding for her.
Well, and before the break, we talked about expectations, but that same strategic expectation has been put into play with the moderators. And so going into the first debate, Trump has already talked about the idea that the moderators fact-checking him will be something that he doesn't want, and that will add an unnecessary layer to the debate. And so what that does, I think, is put pressure on the moderators for all of these debates in terms of how they'll run the debate and the concern that they may have about the story the morning after being about them and not necessarily the candidates. And again, this is a great strategic move on their part, on Trump and the Trump campaign's part, because it shifts the expectation. And so people will be looking for things from the moderators in, again, a way that I don't think people have thought about the moderators playing a role. I mean, Megyn Kelly is sort of the exception with the Republican debates. So I think, again, the idea that there's been a lot of forethought put into the overall strategic picture, and what we talk about is the optics of the debate, I think that that's also going to be unprecedented from previous election years, and certainly even what we saw in the Republican primaries.
A lot of pressure for everyone involved. We actually have a caller here. We're going to turn to the caller and have a listen. Go ahead, caller.
Hi, I have a question for Dr. Rosendorf. I know he's a foreign policy expert. Given Obama's track record and the sentiment of a lot of Americans that he's doing a terrible job with foreign policy. Do you think that that's going to affect Hillary? And do you think that's also possibly something that might be a strength to Donald Trump? So
No.
I'd like to see what your opinion is about that. Thank you.
Well, no, thank you very much. A good question. Although what I'll say at the outset is that Barack Obama actually has general approval ratings that are over 50%, and that's been notable. That he's measured anywhere from 50 even to 54% overall approval ratings. His approval ratings on foreign policy have been lower, but they haven't been in the tank there. So while there are problems that are attached to his foreign policy presidency, those by themselves I don't think are going to drive, certainly they're not driving most Democrats who might be changeable over to Donald Trump. They're not driving that very, very tiny sliver of undecideds in the direction of Donald Trump either. You know, Hillary Clinton has gotten some guff on the basis of Benghazi, obviously, for her support of her ardent support, excuse me, of the Libya intervention. But I don't think these are deal breakers. I mean, the big stuff when it comes to foreign policy would be issues of trade first and foremost, and immigration there. You know, she was forced to back off her support of TPP, and free trade agreements in general there. And immigration, she's stuck to her guns. I mean, that becomes a very, very sharp dividing line between the two, and that is a foreign policy issue. So I wouldn't overdraw the weakness of Obama on foreign policy.
Okay, I hope both of those subjects come up tomorrow. Going back to Donald Trump and his debate style, he, as you said, pushed the buttons of some of the potential candidates, and we can probably expect to see some of that tomorrow. But does he also have to show some self-control?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that the point made about how many people are watching this, I think that there are probably an even split of folks that are curious about where the country is headed politically, as much as there are people that are interested in the reality television element of what's gone on. And I think that's one of the things that's interesting. If you use Facebook as a model, I mean, people have created a new way to channel information, and so our participation in the dialogue about politics is very much me-centric, and we can isolate ourselves in a stream of information. And I think the people that like what Trump is saying are going to tune in because they want to see something rash, and they want to see something where he tells it like it is. And I think that that's something that I think, as both of my colleagues have pointed out, is very hard to come up with a strategy for ahead of time, and it makes it very challenging because then you start to factor in people's reaction to her nonverbals, her reaction to some of these kinds of shifts. And she's had experience with this. In the Senate campaign, there was one defining moment when her opponent, Rick Lazio, crossed the stage to put a piece of paper in her face. At that moment, New York voters really changed their tune on Hillary Clinton. So I think that from her own experience and from what their preparation has been focused on, the hope is that there is a moment that is so clear and so reveals this kind of brashness that it might have that kind of rollover effect. But given that, and given Trump's understanding of how media works and how to set the spectacle on stage, I think it's going to be very hard for that moment to actually occur.
And what about as she does respond to something like that, does she have a different standard as a woman?
Well, I'm not sure if there's going to be a different standard as a woman, but there's certainly different expectations. If you think of the zinger that the candidate can launch that characterizes their opponent, and I think of a couple of memorable ones in the past, Lloyd Benson's "You're no Jack Kennedy," or Ronald Reagan on the other side when he said he would not use age as a part of the politics and exploit the youth and inexperience of his opponent. So I think in terms of that sort of expectations of the one-line zinger used to characterize an opponent, certainly the expectation is much higher for Donald Trump to launch one of those zingers. If Hillary is able to do that, I think that's going to be more effective in the context of this debate.
How is it that some people say they don't know who Hillary Clinton is? She has been in politics for decades in the media. Why do you think that is?
I've done a lot of thinking about that issue, and just one speculation is that we know a lot about her in terms of her political character, but maybe not a lot about her as a person. And if you look back to her husband, Bill Clinton, when he ran for office, we knew about his upbringing. We knew he was from the town of Hope, Arkansas. We knew he grew up with a strong single mother and an alcoholic father. We knew a little bit about his childhood and his experiences growing up. And I'm sure Hillary and Donald Trump also have that narrative, but we haven't heard so much of that narrative for either of those candidates. We've heard more about their business acumen or their political experience. And make no mistake about it, this is an era when many of the electorate think that the system is broken. And the narrative with Hillary Clinton is she's very experienced working within the system, and the narrative with Donald Trump is he's got a lot of experience working outside of the system.
And I would actually, I would take a little bit of a different view and say that in fact there is so much about Hillary Clinton that it's difficult for Clinton as a candidate and as a campaign to come up with a cohesive narrative. Whereas I think the opponents, and in this case both Trump and the Republican Party, have so much information that they can cast a new narrative virtually as necessary. So the narrative about Benghazi was particular. It was very nationalistic. It was hyper-patriotism. But then they can turn the corner and they can say she was an awful Secretary of State and wasn't involved and wasn't engaged. And so these would be, if you put them on paper, competing narratives. She's really engaged or she's so unengaged. But the ability to be able to take so much data, to be able to create these narrow channels where people are getting the message that they want to hear when it comes to that gives them, I think, a much wider range. I think with Trump, while you do have some examples of, clips from Howard Stern or clips from television, that narrative is actually fairly limited. I mean, there's a lot in terms of negative about business dealings, but really and truly, because there's not a large narrative about foreign policy engagement, because there's not a narrative about environmental policy, it's very easy for a campaign to construct a narrative that is so narrow that speaks to the base of voters. And in this case, I think we're already seeing that. I mean, this wasn't a fluke. The number of voters that voted for Trump in the primary was really overwhelming. I mean, this is not somebody who just came from nowhere over the course of that year.
I'll stop you there for just a quick sec. We're going to take a break and we'll be right back. Okay, so what do you guys... Welcome back. We are talking about the presidential debate tomorrow night. I should mention that this is just the first one, certainly getting a lot of attention, and you believe that the negativity that we've seen so far may just be the tip of the iceberg?
Oh, I think we're at the tip of the ugly iceberg. I think we have not only the debates, but we have the real ground war, which starts now as the candidates are moving state to state into the battleground states. I think the interesting thing for the Trump campaign is that the Republican Party was fairly split going into the nomination and the convention, but I think that from a strategic standpoint, the party more so than ever is now starting to fall into lockstep. That's important for funding, that's important for all of the strategic tools the party has, and it's important for the proxies that will also go on the campaign trail for Trump. And so I think we are going to see a very, very harsh campaign. I think we are just getting started.
All right, and what you want to see tomorrow is what?
Well, although I'm an expert on emotion and I want to analyze the nonverbal behavior, I think that the typical viewer, they want to pay attention to the content of the debate and the arguments and make their decision based on that.
Okay, and you've got some, in closing, some good advice.
Well, right, exactly. I think it's important to say, for gosh sake, get out and vote. There, it's the privilege of Americans. It's the responsibility of Americans. It's an easy way to carry out your responsibilities. You don't have to rappel down a cliff. You don't have to dodge bullets. You don't have to storm the beaches. All you have to do is go into a polling booth and fill in some little circles with black, and all of a sudden you're an American hero. And oh yeah, you get to choose the most powerful person on the face of the earth. Yeah. That's pretty cool.
And they say every vote counts, and I think it certainly does. The race is so close right now. Thank you all very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Remember, you can watch the presidential debate tomorrow night right here on ABC-7. The debate begins at 7 o'clock, and if for some reason you can't watch the debate, we'll have a full recap for you on ABC-7 at 10. Thank you for joining us. I'm Stephanie Guadian, and this has been ABC-7 Extra.